Hey, Sweet Family, my name is Chantay White-Williams and I teach in the English department. This video is all about how I see and approach Hyflex theory in my classes. I am of the mindset that in order for any pedagogy to work, it has to work both for the students we have, not for the students we necessarily dream about, as well as for the instructor. So all the things that I'll be talking about here is how I use this to engage my students, but also to manage my workload. I hope there's something in here that is intriguing to you, and please feel free to email me with any comments or questions you might have.
So here we go. All right, so I had a problem. Maybe it'll sound familiar to some of you. Around 2015, I started really getting discouraged about my classes, particularly my online classes. I was ranging about 60% completion rate in English 101, and I wanted it to be a better class. So I thought, I just need to rethink it. I was frustrated with students withdrawing, students just disappearing. And actually, it wasn't just my online classes. A lot of this was happening in my face-to-face classes too. I was wondering why students don't read, why they still showing up and they turn nothing in. Again, might sound familiar. I was tempted to think it's just me, it's got to be me. What am I doing or what can I do? But what I found in talking to colleagues is that it was a lot of people. And if you look online and you include yourself in any, pedagogy chats or professional organization list shares, it's a pretty common, feeling, particularly in community colleges. So my goal was to find a new approach, find a way to adjust, what I was doing, keep what was working, but add to it. So, of course, I started looking at different parts of the literature. What do people already know? So I'm just going to briefly kind of flip through these, but I promise I will provide a works cited so that you can look at these on your own. So, of course, complete college, love them or hate them. I know a lot of us do both. But this line, ultimately, community college students, returning adult learners, are trying to navigate a system that was not built for the complexity of their lives. That really stuck with me, that my students were different than the traditional, 4-year college students that we think of, often different than just traditional, community college students. And that, when we're thinking about it, the way that our classes are scheduled, these random blocks, well, maybe not random, but, 50-minute blocks of classes 3 days a week, 75-minute 2 days a week, mostly in the daytime. Who can do that as an adult? Who can do that if they have a job? And the reality is a lot of our students do, but it's difficult. Other things I looked at, Extending Graduate Education to Non-Traditional Learners by Tom Nesbitt. Really loved this particular research finding. So basically his premise is saying that, in graduate classes, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen the development of all these really cool, awesome programs. Think Lindenwood and the 50 different ways you can take a class there. And that those models, all this energy that we've put into allowing people to go back to college once they have a bachelor's degree, are really more applicable to community college students, because our student population looks more like what we would traditionally think of as a graduate returning student. They have families, they have jobs, they have other obligations, and they often don't have someone paying or footing the bill for them. So again, it sounds a lot more like my students than the students that were in mind when people created the college system, even the class system that we have at SWIC, that very traditional blocked sense of classes. So in this particular article, one of the things that really stood out to me was the idea of thinking about adult-centered learning. And I know for a lot of people, when they think of adults, unfortunately, they don't think of our students, but our students are adults. Even, at 18, they are adults. And how are we sensitive to that? And some of the things that they talked about were really things that we already do, or at least I know I was already doing: being inclusive, being supportive, being respectful of student differences. I mean, that's like really high on my list. But this one is circled here, personal preference. That's the one that really shook me, that maybe I shouldn't just be concerned with kind of all of these tick the box items, but what was needed for that particular individual student. All right. And the last one that I really suggest that you look at, if this is something that resonates with you, is the Handover Report. This came out in 2018, and it was really about how we increase retention and success rates in higher ed overall. I'll warn you that, out of these findings, and the vast majority of the report really deals with things that are institutional level, right? Everything from how we advise and administer registration to, how we block course schedules, days of the weeks, particular times, cohorts, those types of things. Those are not things that I have control over in any individual class. But these last two really deal toward what I can do in my class. And so what really stuck out to me in these findings is that most students today are predominantly interested in flexible scheduling option. Now let this just sit with you for a second, right? Flexible scheduling options was important in their findings in 2018. We are living literally through a pandemic. So we know that given that what's going on in our world and our society today, if this was true in 2018, it's true on steroids in 2020. So this is, the type of thing that I think, for me, when I started looking at this, really resonated with how I could better connect and engage my students and get them, to my goal, to those finish line here. But today, when we're thinking about the pandemic and how we're teaching in our classes, it's even more important to consider the theory behind how some of these things work. So I said all that to say, this is what I came to, right? This is the crest of what this presentation is about. That I can restructure my classes to better fit the needs of the students that I have, even if I can't change, meeting patterns or the amount of students in my class or, requirements from, the community college board or any of that, right? I can't change that, but I can restructure what I do. And I think that in that restructuring, those needs, the things that my student needs, more practically align with kind of these, awesome things that have been designed for graduate working adult learners. And that these policies, this pedagogy model, can and should be adopted for community college students. So the model specifically that I'm talking about is the Hyflex theory of teaching. Now, I know that Hyflex is the education buzzword of 2020. I've heard it over and over and over again, and almost every time I hear someone use it, I cringe. Because the reason for that is that normally when people are talking about Hyflex, they're really only talking about the fourth bullet point that you see here, equal access, the idea of location, that I am teaching both simultaneously in a classroom and online somewhere. And that's awesome. That's one part of Hyflex pedagogy. But as you can see here, it's not the only part of Hyflex pedagogy. And I make the argument, or I'm going to attempt to make the argument here, that that last part, that equal access part, where we're in two places at once, which by the way is really hard to do, doesn't work well if you're not thinking about the totality of the theory. So they're really about four main points in Hyflex pedagogy, starting with student choice, that idea that we have an end road or end goal that we're trying to get students to. And instead of just, creating a syllabus that, walks them to that on one path, that we can give them multiple paths to reaching that goal. Equivalent instruction. Notice that it doesn't say equal, it says equivalent, right? That no matter how you choose to walk the road of this class, what path you choose to take to get to our end goal, what location you're at, face-to-face or online, that you get the same quality of instruction, no matter what choice you make. Reusability. The idea that the materials that are presented in the course are all things that students can continually come back to. And then there's that equal access part. And so in my class, I've done this in several different ways, starting with thinking about the cost of the materials and the accessibility of the materials in the course themselves. And I know that there's been a couple of really good presentations about making sure that the materials are accessible to students, but also in terms of locations and timing of materials. So again, teams versus the classroom, how does all that work together? These four things put together is Hyflex Pedagogy. And let me tell you, I am really a fan. Okay, so pause. In the next part of this presentation, I'm really going to walk you through how I implemented these four theory points within my English 101 class. I know in advance that we all don't teach English 101, and so that some of these things might not be as applicable to your class as I would love them to be. However, my point here is that you think about ways in which you could adapt the idea, not necessarily the exact thing that I did. So that first tenet of Hyflex Theory is student choice. So before I started really thinking about how I can include these items in the way that I approach my English 101 class, I had a very traditional type of class. So students would get a syllabus and a course calendar at the beginning of the semester. And on that course calendar, every week had, what was due that week, what you're reading that week, when exams were, when papers were due, everything was outlined so that in each week students knew exactly what it was we were working on. And I thought that was, a really clear communication and a cool way to go, like that made sense. It would be easy for students to follow along. When I started implementing changes, one of the first changes that I implemented was in terms of how students view the work in my course. I wanted them to have more of a role in their choices. So these are some of the choices that students were given in the beginning of fall 2020 when I did this, pandemic style. So first, it's more than possible to complete the requirements of the class in as little as 8 weeks, even though it's a 16-week class. How do I know this is possible? I teach it in 8 weeks in the summer all the time. Where it's more than possible to complete this class 100% online if you choose to, or if we needed to, which we did after Thanksgiving. How? In the place of traditional essay assignments, for some assignments, students can choose to replace a portion of their work with podcasts or scripted podcasts or videos. So I wanted to give them choices in how they get to that end goal. I call this class my choose your own adventure class, right? So I talked about being able to do it, in an accelerated format, even though this is not an accelerated class. It's an option that students have. The first assignment in the class is always synchronous. It has a set due date because I need to assess students where they are and see if there are any things that I need to add or adjust the class as we go along. But all other assignments are determined at the pace that the student sets. So they could get done quickly or they can start later. It kind of depends on what they need. The other part of my choose your own adventure classes is in those assignment choices. So of course, English 101 is a transfer level course. It has IAI requirements that are pretty strict and not bending, right? We don't want them to bend. So I had to think about how I could structure my choices where I would meet all the requirements of the course objectives as they are given to me. And so in doing that, I allow students to work both collaboratively on some assignments where they can choose to work with a partner or a group, or to work multimodally in which they can choose to do podcasts or essays or videos, depending on what kind of composition they want to produce. So again, choices. The next two tenets of Hyflex pedagogy are equivalent instruction and reusability. And so these are things that I've really worked at implementing in different ways. The first way that I did that was by thinking about how students who miss my classes or students who are online students and not seeing me face to face, again, this is pre-pandemic, would have the feeling of really connecting to me as an instructor and to understanding the material. So I decided to start making like little short 3-minute videos each week for each of my classes. And I've been doing that for about 5 years or so now, so that students receive a video from me every week. It's a YouTube video that says, hey, how you doing? This is what we're working on. This is where you should be. These are some of the questions I've been asked this week, and pretty much go, right? This is what I know, that we've been asked to record our entire lectures, right? So I primarily teach 75-minute classes. And I know that nobody's sitting down to watch a 75-minute video of other people doing things because I teach a lab class. English 101 is about what you're doing in the class. So a good portion of that video would be Black, right? Because we're in breakout rooms or we're writing in Google. We're doing all kinds of other things that really is not going to get captured in the way that a lecture or a presentation similar to this one would be. And even if it was, I doubt that most of you are going to sit through the 20 minutes it takes to watch this video in its entirety. So I don't think that my students would do that either. But 3 minutes, I can get them to watch 3-minute videos, and they do. I can track their views for the class. It works really well for me. The other thing I started doing probably about 5 years ago was teaching with a live Google document. This has really come in handy, even more so this semester, and having all the links to all of the polls or whatever I might want to do in class already provided. But in terms of our tenets of Hyflex Pedagogy, this really does help with equivalent instruction, because no matter if a student is at home on Teams or in the class on Teams, we're all looking at the same thing. We're all using the same live document. So each of them starts the same. They're similar to lesson plans you might already have been doing, what week it is, what class it is, what we're doing today. Also, it will have like all of the items that we're going to approach, the questions we're going to answer in the chat, things that we're going to look at on YouTube or wherever else we're going to look at them. All of this is contained in this document, right? So that when students are doing it, they have something to follow along with, to copy and paste from, to add to. But also for students that miss this document, they have access to, so that they can come back and say, you know, what was the class talking about today? They can look at the question and then look at the chat. It always contains both what we did in class and what we're doing moving forward, right? And so I think in that way, this is something that students will actually look at and access. Again, that long 75-minute video doesn't always do it. And since this is posted, it's reusable, right? Students can come back to it as many times as they need to in order to make sure that they understand what was done in the class that particular day. Thinking about how students access things, no matter where they are, no matter how they choose to do it, no matter what their timeline might be, and that they can continue to access. The last thing I do kind of in this category is individual student conferences. And I've always done individual student conferences in some format my entire teaching career. But I've really increased the amount that I do as the years have went by. And it really falls in line with the theory of, equivalent instruction. The students have the ability to sign up for periods of time where they meet with me to discuss their work. It also allows them to discuss kind of their schedule for how they're completing the work in the class. And it allows them to make choices about when, how, and how long they're meeting with me, as opposed to just the prescribed, we're going to meet for 75 minutes on Thursday. So I use Sign Up Genius for conferences, and students can select from a variety of times that are available to them, both in the daytime and in the evening, sometimes on Saturday, depending on what my schedule looks like, so that they have the ability to be receiving instruction and support in a timely fashion that also works for their actual lives. All right, so that takes us to the last one. The one that people are normally most interested in, that whole equal access. How do you teach both, in the classroom with face-to-face students and online with students that are remoting in from, Timbuktu, wherever they might be. And so we've all, experienced this to some format over the last semester. And I think for most people, it was challenging. Some of it because it was new, and some of it just because it was hard, right? So these are my suggestions. I have been working with Zoom in my classes probably since 2015-ish. And so what I believe works best about equal access is having all the students in one place virtually. So my students, even if they're in the classroom, are all logged into Teams, and wherever they're at in the world, they're logged into Teams, so that we're all looking at the same Google Agenda. We're all looking at the same, YouTube videos or breakout rooms or whatever it is that we're doing. That Teams really does become our class space, even if we are together physically in the room, because this is how I can control that, equal access thing. As I said, this was going to be my short part because there's lots of videos and information out there on this. All right. So the second part of this presentation was about, managing my workload. And so at this point, people normally are like, wow, this sounds like a lot of work, Chantay. And what I will say is that changing my classes in these ways has actually severely decreased my workload. I'd like to think of it as working smarter, not working harder, at the risk of sounding cliche. So this is how it works for me. In my classes, I told you I started with very traditional layouts. Week 1, we're going to do this. Week 2, this is due. So one of the first changes that I made was really severely changing the way items were due. This really helped me manage my grading process. But also it provided that choice, that pathway for students. So in my one-on-one classes, we really normally only have 3, maybe 4, depending on the semester, due dates. As I said earlier, the first essay has a hard and fast due date so that I can assess where students are and what the needs of the class are and make a plan for moving forward. Everything else, right? Their next 3 essay assignments, discussion boards and replies, their success center requirements, peer reviews, and all of their conferences with me, they have 2 months to get done. So you see here the due date of November 17th. This allows them as students to craft their work around the important things in their life. And important things for them might be work, it might be family, it also might be, a social thing, but that's not my call, that's theirs. And I give them the agency to do that. Beyond that, the last date is always the date of our final portfolio. This is where they have to, submit all of their revision work, and it takes the place of an exam in our class. Because I also know that there are students that will struggle with the idea of time management and need a more structured format. All of these individual assignments that are not due for this 2-month period, as I give the assignments all at once, they all have suggested due dates. So for those that need someone to help them manage, I've done that part as well. It's just not required. So how does that help me in terms of workload management? 1, it gives the students true agency. So instead of me sitting over here and saying, you're going to do this when or how, students are making those decisions. That helps in a credible amount of ways in terms of engagement, critical thinking, and then those overall student skills we want them to develop about how and what works best for them in their process as learners. It recognizes them as capable adult learners. And I think too often we don't give our students the credit that they deserve. It also allows for grace without putting me in the position of having to judge what's going on in your life. I said earlier that you can take this class and pass it in 8 weeks. You can do well in 8 weeks. For some students, that's the first 8 weeks. For some students, they take the whole 16 weeks. For a lot of students, it's the last 8 weeks. And that's not my judgment call to make. So think about your classes and how many students, pop up, half after the semester, like, oh, okay, let me get serious now. In my classes, if you do that, you're fine. This minimizes my workload in that it decreases those stressors, right? But also it minimizes the weeks of heavy grading. So I, by choice, teach composition, which means I have a really heavy grading load, right? We're grading essays constantly. And earlier in my career, I would stagger those so that every week I had a different essay coming in from a different class, which meant that I was grading consistently, constantly throughout the whole semester. Managing it in this way means that after that 2-month period, I have about a 3-week period, which I am grading everything. So is it like grading on steroids? Absolutely. Am I doing absolutely nothing but grading in that part of my life? Pretty much. But what it does do is free up the 2 months before, and it allows me to focus my energy on those individualized instruction elements, such as conferences, because I'm not having to block so much of my life off to grade essays. Also, Collaborative assignments give me quite a bit more bang for the buck, right? So if students are working, let's say in a group of 4, for every one comment I make, 4 students are seeing that comment. So that really works well in terms of helping students to move along and managing, what is sustainable for me to be able to do as an instructor. And the last one is because all instruction is digital, students can be redirected to these materials. So this past semester, I taught 6 English 101 classes. So in doing that, when students need to be caught up, I can redirect them back to a YouTube video. I can redirect them back to a class agenda. I don't have to do those things myself because they're all there for them. And because we've used all of these materials together, they already know how to access them and how to use them. So for me, it is severely decreased the amount of work that I'm doing in most weeks of the semester. And it's allowed me to also plan my life because I know that in this month here, these 3 weeks here, all I'm going to do is work. That's it, because I teach English. So what's the payoff? In my classes, I've seen significantly higher completion rates in classes in the past where partial Hyflex learning philosophies have been applied. And even this semester in the fall, where I've really been doing kind of all 4 of these primary tenets. I've seen a lot of increased engagement in course materials and buy-in from students in terms of the choices that they're allowed to make and the access that they have to instruction materials that might be a little different than what they expected to have in college and typically see in a lot of their courses. So for me, this has really worked. I immediately, once I started making the changes for the choices and the due dates, saw that completion rate go up by about 10%. And even in a pandemic semester, I had one one-on-one online class this semester, and I had 70% of the students complete that class and receive the credit that they needed for their degrees. So that was really important to me to be able to see those completion rates go up, even in a class, even in a semester like this, that's really challenging for both me and my students. So I am truly a fan of Hyflex Pedagogy in its entirety, right? Not just that I'm on teams and in the classroom at the same time, but that I am truly giving agency to my students to make the choices that are best for them as adult learners, so that they can decide how they want to approach the requirements of the course, that they feel that they are being given equivalent instruction no matter how they approach it, that all the materials that I provide to them are reusable. They can continue to come back through them through the course of the class, and that they have equal access to me, even if they are at home. So those things were important to me, and I've really seen them increase the success rates of students in my courses. I really appreciate you listening to this really long video. As I said, I talk a lot, but I really appreciate your time. And I hope that you found something here that, while it might not be my approach, has made you think about ways that you can approach different items within your course.
And that's all I have, folks. Thank you for hanging in this long. And again, any comments or questions, or if you just want to have a conversation, please reach out to me. I would love to hear from all of you. Good luck walking into our second COVID semester in January.